So tell me a little bit about your background, Dave, and
Sure.
uh,
Yeah, sure. Well, professionally, I started as a physical therapist, and I did a lot of work with people with traumatic brain injury, stroke, other neurological disorders, problems, and in pediatrics. And over the years, I added to that different kinds of body work and alternative ways of helping people heal. And my work switched to working with people with chronic pain. And then I decided to go back to school for a second graduate degree in psychology with a specialty in somatic psychology. And there I met Peter Levine and delved into the world of somatic experiencing and have been steeped in it for, gosh, since 1993. And in various different facets of the work, different orientations to it. I teach all levels of the SE training. I teach my own bodywork training that I developed, relational bodywork and somatic education, which is for trauma practitioners. I teach master classes in somatic experiencing and do consultations, et cetera, all over the world.
what made you decide to design a workshop around concussion and PTSD?
Yeah, it wasn't a pre-planned idea at all. There was a day, a client I was working with this one day, maybe 20 years ago or so, more than 20 years. And he was referred to me because of chronic headaches and anxiety, general anxiety, which is not uncommon for the kind of folks that I would get referred to me. And I'm working with him. What had happened is that he was racing sleds. Now in New Hampshire in the winter, sleds are actually snowmobiles,
Hmm.
and he flipped it and rolled down a hill. It was not his first time doing this, but with this particular one, his life changed dramatically. And I was talking with him at the beginning of it, I think it was the second session, and his eyes for a brief moment changed, and I thought to myself, those eyes look very familiar, but I couldn't place it. He wasn't really dissociating. It wasn't tearing. There wasn't tightness. There was just sort of a brief moment of vacancy. He wasn't there, but not in a dissociative kind of way. And he was talking. We interactions were pretty typical. And I pondered this for quite some time. And it dawned on me, those are the eyes that I saw working with people with traumatic brain injury while they were coming out of a coma or shortly thereafter, or as they were progressing through these various stages of recovery. And I started wondering, what is this relationship between brain injury, because he had a brain injury, and anxiety and PTSD and headaches? There's something in here that showed up for that brief moment in his eyes. And so I started thinking about what happens when someone has a concussion and what happens in the development of what leads to PTSD. And there are commonalities. For example, the very first thing that happens when someone is in shock trauma is it's a breach of our boundaries, our personal space and our physical space. Not all trauma is physical space, but much of it can be. So in a concussion, when someone has a concussion, their energetic space, but then also their physical space. For example, if they're hit on the head, is breached. There's a boundary breach with both PTSD and concussion. That's very interesting. I know how to work with the boundary breaches from PTSD, but I never thought about it from concussive work before. So I started utilizing some of the interventions, the techniques, the skills that I learned from Peter Levine and somatic experiencing, but in a very different way, much more locally with much more precision around the head. And things start to change for people. Um, but not completely. Of course, not completely, because trauma takes time. But some of the post-concussive okay, so there's that piece. If we look at symptoms as well, so we're wondering, wow, there's a relationship here between the symptoms of post-concussive syndrome and post-traumatic stress disorder. We know it's not a disorder. Cognitive deficits, emotional lability, difficulty working, school. There's a host of overlapping symptoms. This isn't coincidence. There's something here. So again, I started playing around in yet a different way with the overlap, what I consider to be an overlap. Now, when someone has PTSD, let me say, did that answer your question? Because I'm going much deeper into an
Yes,
answer than just your question right now.
yes, it answered it. Now I'm curious about what you're sharing. Yeah,
Yeah. So with PTSD, we think in terms of the autonomic nervous system, the non-conscious reactions, behaviors, etc., go into what we call dysregulated state, the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic. But there doesn't necessarily have to be a physical assault on the body. With post-concussive syndrome, there does need to be a physical assault on the body, usually around the head, but it doesn't have to be. It could be up through the tailbone as well. And there's something more that happens that, and coming back to that idea of a boundary breach. So you've got, I don't know where my little squeezy brain is that I usually have on my desk somewhere. I'm looking for it.
little squeezy brain.
A little exercise. It was here, it's gone. But pretend this is your brain with spikes on it. Well, here's the skull. So there's a hit from the outside, boundary breach, but then the brain bounces up against the inside of the skull. So boundary breach, boundary breach, boundary breach, boundary breach, over and over again. So wow, how can you work with a defenseless structure in the body? You can't flee from it. The brain can't flee. The brain can't fight back. The brain is at the mercy of the fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid as a cushion that has gotten overwhelmed. How can you work with that? And we can go into this later, but there's a hands-on component that has to be addressed, but the outside of the head has to be addressed first for the boundary breach. In PTSD, we don't necessarily have that with the brain bouncing around. So we're working with external boundary breach, either physical or energetic, visual, sound, etc. So.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So how big or how small does the force of impact need to be for us to have like a concussion or a mini concussion? Like, is there a set rule, or is there like how easy do we get a concussion? Do we always notice it?
Yeah. The second part of that question is even more interesting than the first part. There is from the laws of physics a way to determine how much force is needed. I don't know the answer to that. But it's enough to overwhelm the protective layers and the shock absorbers of the neck moving around and the cerebrospinal fluid. Part of it will depend on the direction, the part of the skull that was literally impacted, whether it was from the bottom up where it reverberates or more directly. In the word minor traumatic brain injury, MTBI, is used compared to a major one where there's a skull fracture with or without loss of consciousness, coma, etc. But really, all of them are major when it comes to outcomes. And many people don't realize that they've had a concussion, and or it's so normal to have a concussion that, and I put normal in quotes, meaning we minimize it. We often minimize the effect of it until years later. I would say that at least at least 50%, if not more, of every client practitioner sees who has PTSD has had a concussion, at least one. But the phrase "get back up on the horse" and "get back into the game," "big boys don't cry," uh, "I got to do better in school, so I just have to keep going to school." We override it until we can't, in that way. So many trauma practitioners, though, don't recognize or even ask. And even if you ask, people will say, "No, I don't think so," until you start describing the ways you can get a concussion. They say, "Oh, I fell on the ice. Yeah, I did see stars when I was a kid. Yeah, that was a concussion." It can come out like that too.
Yeah. What are some symptoms or some signs that, when we bump our head or we would have a fall on the ice or, anything related that would make us realize, oh, this might be sort of mini concussion.
Yeah, or a concussion of any
Yeah.
sort. Immediately, sometimes there's nothing until an hour or two later, or maybe even the next day, when some of the acute symptoms might come on. Sometimes it's more acutely. Occasionally, sometimes someone will get knocked out for 5 seconds to a minute or two, and then they get back up. Um, but it can still be a concussion. I'll come back to diagnosis later. People may feel momentarily or for many, many minutes or hours disoriented, may see stars in their visual field. They may have difficulty sleeping, general agitation or exhaustion, but not look back and say, "Oh yeah, during that soccer game, when my head actually went when I went to head the ball, but I hit that kid's shoulder. I kind of staggered for a minute, but I was in the game, so I kept playing." Right? That stagger's not benign. That stagger meant something.
Yeah.
So it could be many things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Are there as practitioners, are there any signs where we could notice, like a little bit like you described with your client, where their eyes were vacant for a moment? Like, are there any other signs or any other ways you would say, that's
Mhm.
interesting things to notice?
Um, if it's acute, let's say someone has an appointment with you, and earlier that day they were ice skating, and they come in and say, "My neck is really tight. I fell on the ice." And then you need to ask questions, and it might be, and this is not uncommon, they just don't seem like themselves. Again, let's talk about diagnosis in a little bit, because that's an important thing. They may just feel off, or that type of thing, but that's only if you're seeing them acutely. And then you might notice, wow, your eyes look very different than usual for a brief moment or so, or pupils might be dilated. If it's quite a while past, not necessarily, unless you know what you're looking for and you suspect they may have had a concussion. And there'll be moments, to use the SE parlance, the SE terminology, there'll be moments during an activated state when you might notice something changed in their eyes that you hadn't really noticed before, or you might think they're dissociating at that moment, but they're not really dissociating. They're here, they're present, but there's something, and it's very brief. It might go by very briefly. A look in their eyes, the pallor of their skin tone, but you need to know some of their history as well. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. When I was talking to a few other of my colleagues, uh, they are curious when they read, concussion and PTSD, but one of the typical questions that comes is, I've never had a client come to me with the issue of having a concussion. Why would this work then, be so
Yeah.
important? Yeah. How would you
Yeah.
answer that question if they would ask it to
I
you?
would say, yes, you have, but they just don't know it, and or you've not asked the proper questions, and or you're not taking a complete enough history. Sometimes it's this sort of thing that you just have to ask: have you ever had a concussion, or more than one? And even if someone says no, have you ever hit your head, or had your head been hit? think sports, think domestic violence, think motor vehicle crashes, think improvised explosive device, the heavy duty sound wave that the military were exposed to in Iraq and other places. Um, all of those can lead to a concussion. So we need to know what we're asking, or we need to know what we're looking for, and we need to ask questions.
Yeah, yeah. So what I've personally found out, because most of my clients come with, either relational or attachment or developmental issues or questions. Um, and some of them have been, doing millions and millions of therapy sessions and, having some benefit, of course, but still something has not fully changed. So what I find out with some of them, uh, when I would work with either like a fall or a motor vehicle accidents or even surgery, like a more, physical shock-based trauma, that only by working through that something really start to change also in the relational and attachment field of what their original question was about. So it sounds a little bit similar to what you're saying about, working with concussion.
Mhm.
So from your experience, um, do you have a similar experience? And if yes, why do you think that is, that some of these more physical impacts are so intertwined with the
Yeah.
more relational attachment field? Yeah.
When someone's had a minor traumatic brain injury, concussion, after time, this is my normal state, right? But I wasn't always like this. So after 5 years or 10 years, or this is who I am, but it's a dysregulated who I am, and not because of necessarily because of developmental trauma or emotional trauma. Those might be part of it, and then they start to dance together. But after I've been shaken up so badly, and my brain is bounced around, a week goes by, 2 weeks, I'm sort of back to my baseline, even though I know something's still up. Well, then that's what I'm bringing forward with me. And when I have that argument with my partner at home, I don't even know that now I'm dysregulated because of my brain condition, but I think it's because of all the other things. So you're right in working with the idea of concussion along with PTSD, relational trauma, etc. Something will begin to change, and techniques, interventions that I utilize also help support that. When we think of PTSD, anxiety, depression, chronic pain, we tend to think of the autonomic nervous system. When I work with couples, I think in terms of the autonomic nervous system of the couple. Fight, flight, the whole threat response cycle, as we talked about in somatic experiencing, can all be disrupted during trauma. We know that. But the brain sort of says to itself when it's hit real hard inside the skull, oh, a little bit more of this and I could have died. And it's the central nervous system, the structure directly, not only the autonomic nervous system more globally, but directly. And this is that it's more direct, and that it's, in my perspective, a near-death experience or akin to a near-death experience, then that changes somebody entirely. And unless that's addressed, then it will hijack all the other trauma work that you're doing at certain levels, let's say, of activation.
Mm. Yeah, so if I understand you correctly, you're sort of saying like because the nervous system is sort of directly impacted, the physiology is already changed by that impact, and sort of all subsequent events or all other traumas might be overcoupled to because of this direct impact. So,
Yeah, and I would even say overcoupled is too light of a concept for this. This is more like Velcroed together, and they cannot be unvelcroed. You need to work with them simultaneously and or so quickly, sequentially, that it's almost like simultaneous, um, to address it all at one time. Yeah.
of how the working with a concussion can influence or impact all the other trauma work that's connected to it.
Well, I think trauma healing is a domino effect in many ways. You work with any trauma experience and broaden someone's capacities for love, for any affect capacity, let's say. Um, it will affect other trauma experiences. If you work, and I have a particular way of working directly with the brain structures from the outside, but then hands on as well, then they can get more regulated also. And then when you start looking at it through the lens of a near death experience, that becomes extremely precision oriented work. That's on the third day of the workshop. I bring in some of that material. Then you're really addressing some of the nuances that need to change. And that's really working with kind of both, the conglomerate of both.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
really,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So in essence, even though the workshop is about concussion and PTSD, I mean, literally, you'll be working with both the concussion and all the other trauma, PTSD
Yeah.
symptoms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll give you one example because this is so common and often a very first intervention. Let's say in this case, you do know someone has a concussive history, maybe 3 or 4 concussions. By the way, one concussion plus one concussion does not equal like one broken bone plus one broken bone. Oh, I have had 2 broken bones. No, with 2 concussions, they potentiate each other. They grow and grow. It's like I have one bigger one and one bigger one and all. But this is a really common scenario. You're talking with someone, they're telling you their history, and they just sort of scratch their head or touch their head. And I know, or I suspect, that they've had a concussion. Okay? I'll pause and say, hey, let's put everything to the side for a moment. You had your hand on your head, put your hand right there, and you want to get very directive, very precise. It wasn't quite there, it was back just a little bit. Yeah, there, right there, right there. Now, without thinking about it, just notice what happens when you slowly move your hand away from your head. Right now, you have to say, keep going, keep going, keep going, because you don't want it to stop in this um, this area where the brain is saying, I know this. This is like when I got boom, boundary breach, right? Keep going, keep going, keep it. So you're opening up the boundaries. Now, what are you doing? You're working with the boundary breach now by opening it, and you're saying, hey, brain structure, you've got more space than you think you have. All right. So you really, that's an example of working with both simultaneously. And people can have many different reactions to that. We don't need to go into the details of right now, but that's often a first step. Yeah. I was going to mention how we diagnose a concussion because many people don't know that they've had. It's really important for everybody to know that medical testing, blood work, x-rays, MRIs, CAT scans will come back normal for concussion. They don't show up on testing, on imaging. We need to know, has someone had what's called a mechanism of injury? Basically, has their brain had an opportunity to be jostled around inside their skull? That's a big one. And if not, then it's not a concussion. But if it is, then that's a good likelihood. In what way is it affecting their everyday life, whether it's work or sleep or eating or relational dynamics, school, etc.? And oftentimes, a friend or a family member will say, ever since you fell down those stairs, yeah, I know it hurt, but nothing else, nothing broke. But ever since that happened, you just haven't been the same. And you did say you hit your head, so I'm wondering, right? So someone else will often report it.
You've
Right?
mentioned a few times that you would also include touch.
Yeah.
Um, so also for this workshop, as we'll do some table work or touch work, uh, uh, can we also do that even if we're not like a manual therapist?
Oh yeah, just like any other good trauma healing work, you need a continuum of ways to work with people, and offering the possibility of the hands-on work is extremely valuable, as the practitioner feels comfortable, there's a informed consent with the client, etc. And there are times when body workers should probably not be doing the hands-on work yet, that
Yeah,
someone's not maybe not ready for it.
yeah, yeah. And for this workshop, do we need to have an understanding of trauma or PTSD or any other understanding?
We will, we will. I always bring some of the basics of trauma, et cetera, into the workshop, the basics of a concussion into the workshop, and then we look at the overlap. Yeah.
Okay, so there's no real prior knowledge that we would need to know.
Only having some kind of clinical work with people who have had concussions and or trauma. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
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 Yeah. All right. Awesome. What what is your takeaway from like this 3-day workshop? What would like to have people have as a takeaway at the end?
If people come away from the workshop more aware that a history of concussion and therefore PTSD, because to me they happen the same, is much more prevalent than realized, and they learn that there are questions that need to be asked that usually aren't, I will be very happy. I'll be extremely happy if, and they will. I mean, they will. So I will be extremely happy, that they'll learn additional ways to help people who have this um, algorithm of yuck from PTSD and concussions. Yeah. There's hands-off ways of working with people. There's hands-on ways of working with people, and then understanding it through the lens of near-death experience. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else you would want people to know who might be interested in following this workshop?
Um, Come join. It's even if I say so myself, it's a really good workshop, and it's so valuable. It's so valuable. I've been teaching. I developed this 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. I've been teaching it for a long time. The feedback I get is that something like, I don't know how I could work with trauma and this kind of material before without understanding this. And just to say how poorly understood this relationship is, that the physical healthcare world looks at this through the lens of physical injury, concussion, et cetera. The mental health world looks at it as, oh, they have anxiety or they have PTSD. But now another thing that'll make me happy with people coming away from the workshop is, you may be the very first person to ever ask a client, have you ever had a concussion? Do you know anything about PTSD and the relationship between the two? There's almost nothing that I've seen in published literature about this relationship. I've seen 3 articles in all these years. One didn't even speak about the two, even though both were in the title. Um, One really was kind of off course with understanding it, and a neurosurgeon who's also an SEP. We've had interesting conversations, and concussions is one of her specialty areas. She agreed with me. She said, "Yeah, there's nothing really about this." Um, and then one was an article in process, a research um, uh, thing going on. I was kind of looking over someone's computer on the airplane once. Oh, that looks like an interesting title. So I engaged her in a conversation. She was a medical student at one of the med schools in the US, and she was on a team doing a research project about this. But she didn't know anything about it. It was so interesting. So I asked her if she sent me a copy of the article when it's done. And that was about 7 or 8 years ago. So
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yes. So it's still very unexplored. Uh,
It's unexplored, underappreciated, and not well understood. Exactly.
yeah. So
Yeah.
after the 3 days, we will be more or less experts.
You will be experts in training. Yes.